It was the last weekend of July 2004. A small Midwestern town had just endured another day of punishing heat, the kind of summer when even the street lamps seemed to sag in the humidity. But by dawn on Sunday, whispers spread along Main Street. The Carter family was gone. The hardware store on Elm Avenue, always open even on Sundays, never lifted its shutters. A neighbor passing by noticed the family's Chevy still parked in the driveway. By Monday, unopened newspapers lay scattered on the porch. By Tuesday, the hanging baskets that Mrs. Carter watered faithfully every morning had withered brown. At the elementary school, teachers exchanged uneasy looks. Mrs. Carter hadn't called in sick, hadn't left a note, hadn't answered her phone. She was the kind of woman who never missed a day without notice. At the high school, her 15-year-old daughter Emma's desk sat empty. Classmates joked nervously at first, then grew unsettled. "She never just skips," her best friend whispered. By midweek, customers who relied on Mr. Carter's hardware store grew restless. "This isn't like him," an older farmer told the sheriff. "He's the one who lends you tools when you can't afford them. He doesn't just vanish." The sheriff's deputies performed a welfare check. Inside the house, everything was in order. Dinner plates still drying by the sink, Emma's textbook spread across her desk. No signs of a struggle, no packed bags. Just the stillness of a family interrupted midlife. That evening, the sheriff held a press briefing on the courthouse steps. His words were cautious, but the unease in his voice carried across the crowd. "We have no indication where the Carters may be. Their vehicle remains at the residence. At this time, we are treating this as a missing persons case." Reporters scribbled notes, cameras clicked, neighbors pressed closer. Everyone wanted an answer, but there were none. Just a family, 3 lives that seemed to dissolve into the heavy summer night, leaving a town on edge. What no one could know that evening was that the truth was not buried in the woods, nor lost on some distant highway. It was sealed behind the walls of a roadside motel just a few miles away, waiting to be uncovered 10 years later. Before the disappearance, the Carters were the kind of family people described with one simple word: ordinary. But ordinary in a small Midwestern town meant dependable. It meant everyone knew your schedule, your habits, and even your quirks. That was exactly why their absence struck so deeply, because everyone thought they knew this family by heart. James Carter, 43, was the kind of man who wore the same flannel shirts until the elbows faded thin. His hardware store on Elm Avenue wasn't just a business. It was a meeting place, a lifeline for neighbors who needed a replacement tool or a last-minute gallon of paint. On Saturday mornings, retirees would lean on the counter, coffee in hand, while James explained how to fix a leaky faucet. He wasn't flashy, not ambitious in the corporate sense, but in a town where word and trust meant everything. He had built a quiet kingdom of loyalty. "He'd let me take a power drill home and pay him back weeks later," one neighbor later recalled. "Who does that anymore?" Then there was Margaret Carter, 39, a beloved elementary school teacher. Parents trusted her with more than lesson plans. They trusted her with their children's fears, hopes, and growing pains. Her classroom smelled of chalk dust and lavender hand lotion, and her bulletin boards changed with every season. Pumpkins in October, snowflakes in January. Students remembered her as gentle but firm, the kind of teacher who stayed after school to help a struggling reader sound out words. Colleagues described her as the one who always had her gradebook balanced and her desk spotless. At home, she kept a meticulous ledger of the household expenses, jotting down every grocery purchase with looping handwriting. And then there was Emma, their daughter, 15, balancing the awkwardness of high school with the spark of someone destined to do well. Friends said she was the kind of girl who could sit at any lunch table, smart enough to land on honor roll, kind enough to tutor classmates in algebra, and playful enough to laugh with the drama club kids after rehearsal. In her bedroom, a corkboard was covered with photos clipped from magazines, college campuses, travel brochures, even a few quotes scribbled in marker. "The future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams." The Carters had their routines, the tiny rituals that made them predictable in the eyes of their neighbors. Saturday nights, James locked the hardware store precisely at 6, turned the sign to closed, and walked home with his sleeves rolled up. Margaret would call her sister in Cincinnati around 7. a weekly catch-up about lesson plans and family news. Emma usually sprawled on the living room floor, colored pens scattered, finishing homework while MTV hummed in the background. By 9, the porch light clicked on, the same way it had for years. That predictability was what made the silence so jarring. On the last night anyone saw them, Margaret had phoned a fellow teacher with plans for a Sunday family outing. James had joked earlier in the week about finally fixing the squeaky hinge on the garage door. Emma had been studying for midterms, telling friends she couldn't wait for the pool to open. In every detail, they were a family planning for tomorrow. And yet within hours, that tomorrow dissolved. In the weeks that followed, their neighbors replayed those final days in obsessive detail. A farmer recalled seeing James laugh at the feed store checkout. A grocery clerk remembered Margaret buying cereal and orange juice. Emma's best friends swore they'd made plans to study together that coming week. Each memory was so normal, so painfully mundane, that it only sharpened the mystery. How could a family so rooted in their routines vanish without warning? Reporters later pieced together a haunting image. An ordinary family, photographed at a 4th of July picnic just 3 weeks before they disappeared. James grinning in his ball cap, Margaret holding a paper plate of corn on the cob, Emma with braces flashing under the sun. In the background, fireworks posters fluttered against the fence. A snapshot of small-town life, frozen in time, made unbearable by the knowledge of what was to come. They were the Carters, the family you nodded to at the diner, waved to on the sidewalk, and trusted with your kids. They had no enemies, no scandals, no secrets anyone could see. And perhaps that was the cruelest detail of all, that such a family wrapped in normalcy could simply vanish into thin air. By Sunday morning, the town expected the Carters' routines to unfold as they always had. James Carter should have been unlocking the hardware store, propping the door with that old wooden wedge, and sweeping the sidewalk before customers arrived. Instead, the shutters stayed down. The hand-painted sign that usually read "Open" was never flipped. At first, no one thought much of it. Maybe he was finally taking a rare day off. But by Monday, the chatter started. Regular customers knocked on the locked glass door, cupping hands against the pane to peer inside. Shelves sat in neat rows, untouched. A retired mechanic muttered, "Jim doesn't close 2 days in a row. Not in 20 years." Across town, Margaret's absence at Jefferson Elementary raised its own alarms. Teachers gathered in the break room whispered about her empty desk. "She didn't call in. Not even a message," one colleague said, shaking her head. Parents noticed, too. She wasn't at carpool line, waving at kids. For a woman known for reliability, silence was unthinkable. At Central High, Emma's absence stung sharper. Monday morning, her desk sat vacant. Her best friend Allison kept glancing at the clock, waiting for Emma's cheerful entrance. By Tuesday, when attendance showed 2 days unexcused, the laughter stopped. "She wouldn't skip," Allison insisted to the homeroom teacher. "Not Emma." Neighbors grew uneasy. Mail piled in the Carter mailbox. Newspapers scattered across the porch. The porch light, usually switched on by 9, stayed dark. Margaret's potted geraniums drooped, soil cracked from neglect. "She waters those every morning," said Mrs. Jacobs, the next-door neighbor. "Something's wrong." By midweek, unease had turned to fear. On Wednesday evening, Pastor Hill from the local church knocked on the Carter door, planning to check in. He pressed the doorbell again and again. No answer. The driveway still held the family's Chevy Impala, a car James never left behind when traveling. "They didn't go anywhere," the pastor whispered. That same night, a decision was made. Emma's homeroom teacher, alarmed by her week-long absence, called the county sheriff's office. "A whole family's missing," she reported. "No calls, no signs of them, nothing." Deputies arrived Thursday morning. They circled the property, noting the eerie stillness. The door was locked. Inside, through windows, everything looked ordinary. A dinner plate rested on a drying rack. Emma's backpack slumped against the couch. The sheriff ordered the lock opened. Inside, the deputies moved carefully. No overturned chairs, no broken glass, no signs of forced entry. The family photos still lined the mantel. Emma in her cheerleading uniform, James and Margaret at their wedding, smiling under a shower of rice. It was as if the Carters had simply stepped out, midday, and never returned. The sheriff's report described it as A house paused in time. Beds were made, laundry folded. Margaret's grade book lay open on the kitchen table. Emma's algebra notes were scrawled across loose-leaf paper, problems half finished. Nothing suggested a plan to leave. What unsettled the deputies most was the car. The Chevy Impala sat in the driveway with the keys hanging on a hook by the door. James Carter went everywhere in that car. Vacations, grocery trips, even short errands. For it to be left behind, without bags, without explanation, was a break in the very fabric of his life. By Friday, word had spread. The local diner buzzed with speculation. Some whispered about abduction, others about hidden debts, but most shook their heads. That family had no enemies, a waitress said. If something happened, it wasn't by choice. The sheriff held his first press conference that evening. Flanked by deputies, he faced the cameras. At this time, we have no evidence of foul play, he said, though his face betrayed uncertainty. We are treating the disappearance of the Carter family as an active missing persons investigation. Flashbulbs popped. Journalists scribbled. Townspeople pressed against the courthouse steps. Behind them, the July air felt heavier than ever, as if the whole town was holding its breath. For decades, Springfield had been the kind of place where doors stayed unlocked and neighbors waved from porches. Now, with one family gone without trace, the question on everyone's lips was the same. Could it happen again? The search for the Carters began the way most small-town investigations did, close to home. Deputies canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking the same careful questions. Did you see the family that weekend? Did you notice anything unusual? But every answer was the same. Neighbors had seen nothing, heard nothing, only silence. Inside the sheriff's office, a map of Springfield was tacked with pushpins. Deputies traced possible routes the Carters might have taken if they'd left town voluntarily, but the Impala still sat in the driveway, untouched. They didn't just walk away, one deputy muttered. The lack of modern tools made everything harder. In 2004, surveillance cameras weren't yet common in neighborhoods, and many businesses didn't keep recordings longer than a day or two. Cell phones could have provided clues, but James and Margaret weren't heavy users. James still relied on the landline at the hardware store. Margaret's old flip phone had no GPS tracking, and Emma didn't own one at all. There were no digital breadcrumbs, no pings off a cell tower, only a void. By the third day, investigators widened the circle. They interviewed James's customers, many of whom considered him more of a friend than a shopkeeper. He wasn't in trouble, a contractor said. I'd know. If he owed money, he'd tell me. Margaret's colleagues echoed the same. No signs of distress, no sudden changes in behavior. Emma's classmates were unanimous. She was planning for midterms, even talking about cheerleading tryouts. Everything pointed to normalcy right up until the moment it all stopped. Then came the first glimmer of a lead. A waitress from a diner near the interstate told deputies she'd seen a car resembling the Carter's Chevy parked outside the Sunset Motel, a rundown building on the edge of town. The motel, with its flickering neon sign and peeling paint, was the kind of place locals avoided. Travelers stopped there for a night, truckers for a few hours of rest, but families? Rarely. Deputies drove out that same night. The Sunset Motel sat half-hidden behind a row of overgrown pines, its parking lot littered with broken bottles. The owner, a man in his 50s, leaned against the front desk when questioned. He shook his head firmly. No family checked in that weekend. I'd remember. His night clerk, a thin young man with nervous eyes, gave the same answer. Records from that week showed mostly truck drivers and a couple of salesmen. No Carters. Still, the sheriff wasn't convinced. The waitress had no reason to lie, and her description of the vehicle, a tan Chevy Impala with a dented bumper, was painfully close to the Carter's car. But without a license plate or witnesses who had actually seen the family, it was only a shadow of a lead, and the motel had no cameras. Meanwhile, the investigation grew more frantic. Volunteers searched fields, creeks, and wooded backroads. Police dogs combed through trails but found no scent beyond the Carter home. Flyers went up in grocery stores and gas stations, smiling photos of the family under the words "missing." Please help. Reporters descended on Springfield. Local papers ran headlines like "Family Vanishes Without a Trace." News vans lined Main Street. On camera, Sheriff Whitaker admitted, "We have no evidence of foul play, but we have no explanation either." His words did little to calm a town that had never known such fear. Everywhere whispers grew. Some speculated the Carters had been kidnapped. Others wondered if James had secret debts. But the sheriff's team could find nothing to support those rumors. Bank records were clean. No sudden withdrawals, no credit card anomalies. Margaret's paycheck still sat uncashed at the school office. What haunted investigators most was the stillness of the Carter home. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt interrupted. Coffee grounds remained in the filter, laundry folded neatly in baskets. Deputies kept circling back to one chilling possibility. Whatever happened, it hadn't been planned by the family themselves. By the end of the second week, frustration set in. Deputies drove the same roads again and again, hoping to spot something they'd missed. They questioned motel staff a second time, but the answers never changed. "I told you," the owner insisted, "no family ever stayed here." Still, the memory of that waitress lingered. She was certain of what she saw. A tan Chevy parked near the edge of the lot, the night the Carters disappeared. Whether or not they ever entered the Sunset Motel remained a mystery. But the seed of suspicion had been planted, and as summer wore on, the sheriff's department realized the truth. This was no ordinary missing persons case. The Carters hadn't simply slipped away. Something had happened to them. Something the town could not yet see, hidden in plain sight. By the third week of the Carter investigation, Springfield no longer felt like itself. A town once defined by porch swings and summer baseball games now carried an undercurrent of dread. Parents locked their doors at night. Teenagers who once roamed the streets after dark now hurried home before sunset. Everyone had the same question. How could a whole family disappear in a place like this? The sheriff's office kept repeating the same lines. "We're following every lead. The case remains open." But the silence from investigators was deafening. Behind the scenes, detectives were running in circles. They had no ransom note, no credible threats, no trace of movement beyond the Carters' last known weekend. It was as if Springfield had swallowed them whole. The Carters' relatives refused to let the case fade. Mark Carter, James's older brother, emerged as the family's voice. A city worker in nearby Dayton, he stood outside the courthouse holding a framed photo of James, Margaret, and Emma. "My brother didn't walk away from his life," he told reporters. "Someone knows what happened. Please, if you know anything, come forward." His voice cracked, but his determination never wavered. The media amplified his plea. Local papers splashed headlines across their front pages. "Family vanishes without a trace. Search for Carters intensifies." Soon national networks picked up the story. News anchors framed Springfield as a quiet American town thrust into a nightmare. TV crews parked satellite trucks near the sheriff's office, beaming images of missing person flyers taped to telephone poles across the nation. But with the spotlight came rumors. Some whispered James had a gambling problem, though no debts were ever proven. Others claimed Margaret had been depressed, though her friends denied it. At the diner, speculation ran wild. "Maybe they left for a new life," one patron suggested. "Not them," another snapped. "They wouldn't leave Emma's school books behind." The theories only deepened the unease. For the sheriff's department, the scrutiny was suffocating. Each press conference felt more like an interrogation. Reporters pressed, "Was the motel owner fully investigated? Were the fields searched thoroughly?" The sheriff's jaw tightened as he repeated, "We're pursuing all avenues." Behind closed doors, deputies admitted the truth. There were no new avenues left. The town organized vigils. Hundreds gathered on courthouse steps, candles flickering in the humid night. Pastors led prayers. Children clutched signs that read, "Bring them home." When the church bell tolled, its sound echoed through the silent streets like a collective heartbeat. For a moment, the community felt united in hope. But as days turned into months, even hope began to thin. By late August, leads dried up completely. The waitress who claimed to have seen the Impala near the Sunset Motel could no longer recall details clearly. "It was late. I was tired," she admitted in a second interview. Without her certainty, investigators had nothing solid to stand on. Autumn arrived. Newspapers that once dedicated front pages to the Carters relegated updates to back sections. National news crews packed up their trucks, chasing fresher stories elsewhere. The flyers around town grew sun-bleached and tattered, curling in the wind. Mark Carter kept fighting. He printed new posters himself, handing them out at gas stations and football games. He called radio stations, begging for airtime. "If they're gone, we deserve to know why," he said. His persistence kept the case alive, if only barely. But even he admitted to friends late at night, "It's like screaming into a void." Inside the sheriff's office, morale sank. Detectives who had once worked 12-hour days now shuffled through the same paperwork, the same unanswered calls. Without evidence, they couldn't move forward. And without movement, the case slid toward the fate of so many others. The cold case cabinet in the back of the building. By Christmas, Springfield was quieter. Holiday lights twinkled on porches. But the Carter home remained dark, untouched, a frozen monument to absence. Neighbors still slowed their cars when passing by, staring at the empty windows, whispering the same question over and over. Where are they? The silence had become unbearable. Not just the silence of the missing, but the silence of answers never found. And though the town tried to return to normal, everyone sensed the truth. Springfield had changed forever. What no one knew was that the answer to the riddle had been sealed away all along, behind a motel wall just down the road. But that revelation would have to wait 10 long years. 10 years passed. The Carter case drifted from headlines to whispers, then from whispers to silence. For Springfield, life trudged forward. New businesses opened, children grew up, and the old Sunset Motel, once a blot on the edge of town, grew more decrepit with each season. By 2014, the neon sign had long since burned out, weeds pushed through cracks in the parking lot, and plywood covered half the windows. That spring, a notice appeared. Property condemned, demolition scheduled. The building, inspectors ruled, was unsafe. Most locals hardly blinked. For them, the motel was just an eyesore better erased. But for the few who remembered, there was unease. "That place was always bad news," muttered an elderly neighbor. "I wouldn't be surprised if secrets were buried in there." On a damp April morning, a demolition crew arrived. Bulldozers rumbled, workers in hard hats hauled debris. Inside, the musty rooms told stories of years gone by. Faded floral bedspreads, cigarette-burned carpets, a Bible in a drawer coated with dust. To the crew, it was just another teardown, until one of them noticed something odd. In a second-floor room, when they stripped away the plaster, a wall seemed wrong. It was thicker than the blueprint suggested. The foreman tapped it with a crowbar. Hollow. "That's strange," he said, motioning for the others to help. As the drywall crumbled, a hidden cavity emerged, no larger than a walk-in closet, sealed off deliberately. Inside was a pile of forgotten objects, each coated with a decade of dust. A woman's purse, a school ID badge, a pair of glasses, an old wallet with the name James Carter embossed faintly inside. The room fell silent. "Call the sheriff," the foreman ordered. Within an hour, police had cordoned off the site with yellow tape. Residents gathered outside the chain-link fence, whispering in disbelief as evidence bags were carried out. Some recognized Emma Carter's smiling face on the faded school ID. A hush spread through the crowd. After 10 years, the Carters had returned, if only in fragments. Sheriff's deputies secured the room, waiting for forensic specialists from the state. One officer admitted later, "It felt like the motel was finally giving up its secrets. We'd walked past that wall 100 times back then, never knowing." News traveled fast. Reporters who had once left Springfield raced back with cameras. National outlets revived the story with fresh urgency. Breakthrough in Carter family case. Mark Carter, James's brother, received the call while at work in Dayton. He drove straight to the site, arriving pale and trembling. "Are you telling me, are you sure this is theirs?" he asked an officer, clutching the evidence bag that held Margaret's driver's license. That evening, investigators briefed the press. Sheriff Whitaker, older now, stood grim-faced. "Items belonging to the Carter family have been recovered from a concealed space in the Sunset Motel. We are treating this as a significant development. This case is no longer dormant." Behind him, the setting sun cast long shadows across the crumbling motel, as if the building itself had been holding its breath for 10 years. For the community, the discovery was both relief and dread. Relief that the Carters had not been forgotten, that the mystery might finally unravel. Dread because the evidence confirmed what many had feared. They had never left Springfield of their own accord. Detective Laura Grant, a young investigator trained in the newest forensic methods, was assigned to lead the renewed inquiry. This isn't just about solving an old case, she told colleagues. It's about giving a family, and this town, the truth they've been denied for a decade. As forensic vans drove away that night, the onlookers remained. Some crossed themselves. Others wept quietly. And in the silence that followed, one thought lingered in every mind. If the motel walls could speak, what else would they tell us? The Carter case was no longer cold. The motel's demolition had torn open not just bricks and mortar, but the first crack in a wall of silence that had stood for 10 long years. The hidden cavity inside the Sunset Motel was no longer just a demolition oddity. It became a crime scene, sealed off, guarded through the night, every inch examined under portable floodlights. Forensic teams moved in with latex gloves and sterile kits, treating the motel as if time itself had paused in that room. From the debris came answers. James Carter's leather wallet still held his driver's license, now cracked and brittle. Margaret's handbag contained grocery receipts dated the very weekend the family vanished. Most chilling of all was Emma's school ID, a photo of a smiling teenager with braces preserved beneath a layer of dust. These weren't just personal effects. They were anchors in time, irrefutable proof that the Carters had been inside that motel. Detective Laura Grant, the 32-year-old investigator now leading the case, called it the first real break in a decade. She was part of a new generation of law enforcement, trained in digital forensics, comfortable with advanced lab work, and determined to apply tools that hadn't existed in 2004. "We have to look at this with fresh eyes," she told her team. The motel's walls were scraped, bagged, and sent to state labs. Traces of cement dust revealed layers poured at different times. Specialists concluded that part of the wall had been rebuilt around late July 2004, precisely when the Carters vanished. "Someone went to a lot of trouble to hide this space," one forensic engineer explained. DNA testing began immediately. Swabs taken from the interior surfaces revealed faint biological traces, too degraded for older methods, but not for modern technology. Partial profiles matched the Carter family. It was as if their presence still lingered, written invisibly into the motel itself. Even fibers told a story. A scrap of patterned fabric clung to the cavity's corner, later identified as matching the lining of Margaret's summer jacket. A smear of faded red paint, when cross-referenced, was identical to the Carter family's porch door. "These aren't coincidences," Laura said. "These are threads pulling us back to what happened here." With every lab result, suspicion grew heavier around the motel's former owner, Richard Hayes. 10 years older now, his hair thinned, his voice still steady, he repeated the same line. "That family never stayed here." But the evidence was catching up with him. Records showed that during the summer of 2004, he'd closed off one upstairs room, citing repairs. No contractor invoices were ever filed, no permits pulled. Deputies tracked down old employees. A former housekeeper, now living in Indiana, remembered being told not to enter room 212 for several weeks. "He said the ceiling leaked," she recalled, "but when I walked past, I heard hammering late at night." Another ex-employee, a night clerk, admitted Hayes often appeared after midnight, carrying tools into the restricted room. Witness memories, once hazy, began to sharpen under the weight of new discoveries. An elderly woman who ran the diner across the street confessed she had never stopped thinking about a strange sound that July night. A dragging noise, heavy and deliberate, echoing from the motel lot. She'd brushed it aside back then. Now the detail gnawed at her. Had she overheard a cover-up? Detectives compiled these fragments into a timeline. The Carters had last been seen Saturday evening, buying snacks at a gas station less than half a mile from the Sunset Motel. Their belongings were sealed into a wall that was reconstructed that same week. Every arrow pointed inward, toward one building, one owner, one secret. For Mark Carter, James's brother, the developments were both vindication and torment. Standing outside the crime scene tape, he told reporters, "I said from the start, they didn't just vanish. Somebody knows what happened. Now we're finally proving it." His words trembled with both relief and fury. The town, too, reacted with a mix of hope and dread. Hope that the mystery might finally be solved. Dread because the motel, a place most had driven past countless times, now stood exposed as a tomb of secrets. For Detective Grant, the case was no longer about chasing ghosts. The Carters had left their mark, in fibers, in dust, in memories. The motel had tried to swallow them, but science was pulling them back into the light. And with every new piece of evidence, the question narrowed. Not what happened? That was becoming clearer by the day. The question now was, who would finally break and admit the truth? By summer 2014, Springfield felt like it was holding its breath again. The discovery inside the Sunset Motel had reignited not just the investigation, but every rumor that had once haunted the town. Reporters returned, neighbors whispered, and all eyes turned toward one man. Richard Hayes, the former owner. At first, Hayes played the part of a weary businessman. He told deputies he'd sold the motel years ago, that he'd moved on, that he was being unfairly dragged into a tragedy he knew nothing about. But detectives weren't buying it. The newly uncovered evidence, the sealed wall, the Carter belongings, wasn't circumstantial anymore. It screamed intention. Detective Laura Grant spearheaded the re-interviews. She began with the motel staff, many of whom had long since scattered. Tracking them down was no easy task. One former maid, Carla Simmons, now living outside Indianapolis, remembered vividly the summer of 2004. Mr. Hayes told us room 212 was off limits, she recalled, said it was under repair, but there were no contractors, no supplies, just him, going in and out at odd hours. A second witness, Eddie Morales, who had worked nights at the front desk, described something even more chilling. That weekend, he showed up late, really late, brought in a toolbox. He was sweating, nervous, kept looking over his shoulder. I asked if everything was okay, and he snapped at me, told me to mind my own business. Eddie admitted he'd brushed it off at the time, afraid of losing his job. 10 years later, the memory shook him. Other voices surfaced too. A truck driver recalled staying at the motel that same July weekend. He didn't see the Carters, but he heard hammering in the middle of the night. Thought it was just repairs. Now, I'm not so sure. As these accounts piled up, the image of Hayes as an innocent bystander crumbled. Detectives confronted him with the contradictions. Your employees remember restricted access. They remember you working alone in that room. How do you explain that? His answers faltered. Leaks. I told you. It was leaks, he insisted. But the records told a different story. No work orders, no invoices, no repairs logged. Meanwhile, townspeople began to relive their own unease. At the diner across from the motel, the owner, Mrs. Daniels, finally shared what she had kept to herself for a decade. That night, I heard something heavy being dragged across asphalt. At the time, I didn't connect it. But after the news broke, it's all I can think about. Her voice cracked as she added, I should have said something sooner. The pressure mounted daily. Reporters swarmed Hayes' suburban home, microphones thrust forward as he left for errands. Did you kill the Carters? One shouted. His tight-lipped refusal to answer only fueled speculation. On local talk radio, callers demanded his arrest. He knows more than he's saying, one man argued. If that wall could talk, it'd put him behind bars. Inside the sheriff's office, the investigation team built their case like brickwork. They stacked eyewitness statements, forensic reports, and motel records side by side. Each piece chipped away at Hayes' denials. We're not just circling anymore, Detective Grant told her team. We're closing in. For Mark Carter, the renewed attention was both agony and vindication. Standing outside the courthouse after another press conference, he spoke to a cluster of cameras. We begged for years not to let this case die. Now the truth is finally catching up. My brother, my sister-in-law, my niece, they deserve their story told. By autumn, the pressure was suffocating. Hayes could feel it in every knock at his door, every flashbulb, every question he couldn't answer. The silence he had held for 10 years was no longer impenetrable. It was cracking. And everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the cracks widened into confession. By late fall of 2014, the Carter investigation reached a boiling point. The evidence was piling up like a wall closing in, and Richard Hayes, once the confident owner of the Sunset Motel, now looked smaller every time he appeared in public. His shoulders hunched, his answers clipped. He clung to his denial, but cracks were visible. Detectives had one more card to play, someone who had lived under Hayes's roof the night the Carters disappeared. His son, Michael. At the time, he had been a college sophomore, home for summer break. For a decade, he carried a weight he never spoke aloud. But when the case reopened, the silence he'd kept began to eat at him. Michael walked into the sheriff's office on a gray November afternoon, trembling as he signed the visitor log. "I can't keep this in anymore," he told Detective Laura Grant. What spilled out was the missing piece investigators had been searching for. That July night, Michael remembered his father stumbling home close to dawn. His shirt was streaked with something dark. His hands shook as he tried to light a cigarette. When Michael asked what had happened, Hayes snapped, "Don't ever ask me that again." In the days that followed, the man who once barked orders at motel staff grew restless, paranoid. He drank more, slept less, flinched at sudden noises. "I knew something terrible had happened," Michael admitted. "I just didn't have the courage to say it." Detectives pressed him carefully. Had he seen the Carters? No. But he remembered his father spending nights sealed inside that upstairs room, hammer echoing into the early morning hours. He remembered the smell of fresh cement, sharp and unnatural. His testimony alone didn't prove guilt, but when stacked against the evidence, fibers, receipts, belongings hidden in the wall, it was devastating. When confronted with his son's account, Hayes's composure shattered. In the interrogation room, under fluorescent lights, he sat hunched over, hands clasped tight. For hours he insisted, "They never stayed here. You're all chasing ghosts." But then the detectives laid the school ID on the table. Emma Carter's smiling face stared up at him. "This was found in your wall," Laura said quietly. "You built that space. You put it there." For the first time, his eyes dropped. He exhaled sharply as though 10 years of denial had collapsed in a single breath. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he whispered. His voice cracked, barely audible. "It wasn't supposed to go that far." The confession poured out in fragments. James Carter had owed him money, small by some standards, but to Hayes, struggling to keep his motel afloat, it felt like betrayal. He summoned James to the motel, insisting he bring his family so everyone would understand this was serious. That night, tempers flared. Shouts turned to shoves. James fell hard against the wall. Panic surged. Margaret screamed, Emma cried. In Hayes's telling, fear overtook reason. He silenced them all. The room where it happened, room 212, became a tomb. He worked for days to seal their belongings inside the wall, convincing himself he could erase what had been done. But the motel never forgot, and neither did he. "Every hammer strike still rings in my ears," he admitted through tears. When news of his confession broke, Springfield froze. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others weeping openly. Mark Carter, hearing the words for the first time, said only, 10 years of waiting, and this is what it comes to? My brother and his family deserved so much better." In court filings, prosecutors wrote simply, Richard Hayes knowingly and willfully caused the deaths of James, Margaret, and Emma Carter. The community called it something else. The day a decade of silence finally broke. Winter settled heavy over Ohio when Richard Hayes finally faced a jury. Snow clung to the courthouse steps. Television crews stamped their feet against the cold. And inside, the air crackled with anticipation. After 10 years of questions, Springfield was about to hear answers spoken aloud in a court of law. The prosecution laid out the case like a grim tapestry. Photographs of the Carters beamed from poster boards. Family portraits turned evidence. Bags of belongings pulled from the motel wall sat displayed for the jury to see. Emma's school ID, Margaret's wallet, James's worn leather belt. These items were not lost, the prosecutor told the jury. They were hidden, deliberately, by the man sitting in this courtroom. Witnesses took the stand one by one. Carla, the maid, described the order to avoid room 212. Eddie, the night clerk, spoke of Hayes hauling tools into the room in the dead of night. The diner owner recalled the dragging sounds across asphalt. Each voice added a brick to the wall of guilt closing in around him. Then came the testimony that silenced the courtroom. Hayes's own son, Michael. With shaking hands, he recounted the night his father came home with blood on his shirt. His voice broke as he admitted, "I knew. I just didn't want to believe it." In the gallery, people wiped away tears, not only for the Carters, but for a son who carried the weight of his father's sins for a decade. The defense tried to soften the story. They argued it was a confrontation that spiraled, that Hayes never planned to kill. "It was panic," the defense attorney said. "A terrible mistake." But the jury's eyes lingered on the images of that sealed wall, the years of silence, the deliberate concealment. Mistakes don't get cemented into plaster. Mark Carter, James's brother, sat through every session, his face a mixture of grief and defiance. On the final day of testimony, he spoke directly to the court. "For 10 years we searched, we prayed, we begged for the truth. My family was taken from me, and all we got was silence. Today, I just want one thing: justice." When the jury returned, their verdict carried the weight of the town's collective breath. Guilty on all counts, murder in the first degree. In December 2014, Judge Matthews delivered the sentence: life without the possibility of parole. Hayes showed little emotion, only a downward glance as the words sealed his fate. The courtroom erupted in quiet sobs, relief mingled with sorrow. Justice had come, but closure was complicated. Outside, Mark spoke into a forest of microphones. "We finally know the truth, but knowing doesn't erase the pain. What it does is stop the wondering, and that matters." For Springfield, the case reshaped more than memory. Lawmakers cited it as a reason to strengthen missing persons legislation. Hotels and motels across Ohio face stricter ID and record-keeping requirements. The state launched a cold case task force, promising no family would again endure a decade of unanswered questions. At the Carter graveside, a small service was held. Snow fell lightly as friends and neighbors gathered to finally say goodbye. Emma's classmates, now young adults, placed flowers on her headstone. Margaret's former students left handwritten notes. "Thank you for teaching me to read." James's customers set down work gloves, symbols of a man who had once fixed everyone else's problems. And though the pain lingered, something shifted. For the first time in 10 years, the Carters were no longer a mystery. They were a family, remembered in full, laid to rest with dignity. The motel was gone, reduced to rubble. But the story it tried to hide would remain, etched into Springfield's history as both a tragedy and a warning. Justice had come late, but it had come. When the gavel fell and Richard Hayes was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, Springfield did not cheer. It exhaled. For 10 years, the town had lived beneath a cloud of unanswered questions. And now, though grief remained, the fog began to lift. In the weeks that followed, conversations shifted. People no longer asked, "Where are the Carters?" They asked instead, "How do we make sure this never happens again?" At Jefferson Elementary, where Margaret once taught, her former colleagues organized a memorial reading corner in the library. Children curled up with books under a plaque that read, "In loving memory of Mrs. Carter, who believed every child could shine." Teachers admitted they felt both pride and sorrow. "She gave so much to this school," one said softly. "It's only right her spirit stays here." At Central High, Emma's classmates, now young adults, gathered for a reunion vigil. They carried candles across the football field where she once cheered. "She should have been here with us," her friend Allison whispered. "She should have been applying to college, chasing her dreams." Their grief was tinged with a fierce determination to keep her name alive, not as a victim, but as a friend whose light was stolen too soon. Even James, remembered as the steady man behind the hardware counter, became a symbol. Local contractors and farmers pooled money to create the Carter Fund, a small scholarship for apprentices in the trades. "Jim helped everyone else fix their problems," one donor said. "Now it's our turn to pass that forward." Beyond Springfield, the ripples spread wider. State lawmakers cited the Carter case in debates over missing persons policy. In 2015, new regulations required motels and hotels to verify guest identification, maintain electronic records, and install security cameras in common areas. Police across Ohio received additional training on how to treat family disappearances. not as voluntary runaways but as urgent threats. The FBI's new cold case task force announced that same year included the Carter's photo on its inaugural briefing wall. "This case proves persistence works," one agent remarked. "You never close the book because technology and truth have a way of catching up." For Mark Carter, the brother who refused to let the memory fade, the aftermath was bittersweet. He stood at his family's graves one quiet spring morning, speaking to reporters who asked what justice had brought him. "Closure," he said, shaking his head. "You don't close the door on people you love. But knowing the truth means I don't wake up every night wondering. And that's a kind of peace." In Springfield itself, the old Sunset Motel was reduced to rubble, hauled away truckload by truckload. The lot sat empty for months until the town decided to build a small park. Where once a neon sign buzzed and walls concealed horror, children now climb jungle gyms, and neighbors walk dogs on winding paths. At the park entrance, a stone marker bore three names: James, Margaret, Emma Carter. Beneath it, a single line: "Never forgotten." Years later, new families moved into Springfield, unaware of the shadow it once carried. They saw only the playground, the library corner, the scholarship fund. But for those who had lived through it, the memory remains sharp, a reminder that evil can lurk behind ordinary doors, and that community can rise even from tragedy. The Carters did not vanish into mystery. Their story became one of endurance, of a town that refused to forget, of a brother who refused to stop searching, of investigators who refused to close a file. In the end, the Carters reshaped more than one family's history. They reshaped how a state protects its people and how a town remembers its dead. Springfield may never erase the pain, but it learned to carry it, to turn loss into vigilance, silence into voice. And in the flicker of candles at annual vigils, in the quiet hush of children reading in Margaret's corner, in the steady hum of drills bought with James's scholarship fund, the legacy of the Carters lives on. A decade of silence had ended, and the truth had finally surfaced. Yet in Springfield, the Carter case was never just about crime and punishment. It became a mirror, showing how fragile the ordinary can be, how quickly a single night can upend entire lives, and how resilience can grow in the aftermath of tragedy. For detectives like Laura Grant, the case became a lesson written in scar tissue. "You never walk away from the unanswered ones," she told a group of recruits years later. "Cold cases aren't cold. They're waiting. And every family deserves to be found." In her office, the Carters' photo still hangs above her desk, not just as evidence of what was lost, but as proof that persistence matters. For the people of Springfield, the Carter story changed how they lived together. Neighbors who once waved casually from porches now checked in more often, more intentionally. Church groups organized meal deliveries for families in crisis. When a child didn't show up to school, teachers acted faster, remembering Emma. Vigilance became a kind of shared promise: never assume, never ignore. For Mark Carter, who carried the weight of hope longer than anyone, the story will always remain personal. At the memorial park where the Sunset Motel once stood, he often pauses near the stone engraved with his brother's family name. He doesn't cry as much anymore. He reflects. "They're not just victims," he once said. "They're a reminder to all of us. Don't let silence swallow the people you love. Speak, search, remember." The Carters' absence left a wound, but their legacy created something rare: unity. State officials toughened laws, schools built new safety nets, families across Ohio learned the importance of paying attention to the smallest signs. Out of tragedy, safeguards were born, safeguards meant to keep other families whole, and so their story lives on, not only in Springfield, but wherever someone holds a candle at a vigil, or tapes a missing person flyer to a lamppost, or refuses to give up when the trail grows cold. Their story insists on one truth: that no disappearance should ever be dismissed, no silence left unchallenged, and no family forgotten. The Carters' names are etched in stone at the park, but more importantly, they are etched in the hearts of those who remember. And through their memory, a small town discovered that even in the face of darkness, communities can choose light. So when we tell their story now, of James, who lent tools to neighbors without hesitation, of Margaret, who taught children to believe in themselves, of Emma, whose dreams stretched toward a future she never reached. We are doing more than recounting a crime. We are reclaiming their lives from the silence. And if their memory stirs us to live with greater compassion, to stay vigilant for one another, then their loss has given birth to something enduring. If this story moved you, let it be more than a memory. Share it. Talk about it. Carry it forward. Because remembering is resistance to forgetting. And every view, every voice, helps keep the Carters, and families like them, alive in the world's conscience. If you believe stories like this matter, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Silent Trace. It's how we keep bringing light to the shadows and how together we ensure that no story, no family is ever truly lost.